By the time Clara Whitcomb backed her father's old blue pickup behind Miller's Feed and Supply, half the town already knew something strange was about to happen. The truck coughed twice before it settled into the gravel, its rusted tailgate rattling under the weight of wooden crates stacked 3 high. Inside those crates were 200 chickens nobody else wanted. They were thin, ragged, half-feathered birds with pale combs, dull eyes, and bare patches along their backs, where sickness and neglect had eaten away at them. Some stood crooked on weak legs, some huddled low in the corners. A few barely lifted their heads when the morning sun struck the slats. Clara climbed out without a word. She was 18, small enough that people still called her a girl, though her hands had already hardened into a farmer's hands. Her brown hair was pulled through the back of a faded cap that had once belonged to her father. Her boots were caked with dried clay from the east field, and her jeans carried the green stains of soybean leaves she had checked before dawn. 3 old farmers stood near the loading dock, pretending not to stare. A man in a seed company jacket leaned against his truck with a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hand. Inside the feed store, faces hovered behind the glass door. The cashier stopped sweeping. The owner looked over the counter and shook his head slowly, as if he were watching a young person make a mistake too painful to interrupt. Clara handed over the last envelope of cash from the kitchen drawer. Then she began loading the crates herself. The chickens made a low, broken noise as she slid each box into the bed of the truck. Feathers drifted onto the gravel. Dust rose around her boots. Someone near the fuel pump gave a quiet laugh, and another truck slowed on the road, its driver turning his head to see whether the rumors were true. Whitcomb Farm was already in trouble. Everybody knew that. The north fence had been leaning for 2 years. The barn roof flashed bare tin, where shingles had blown away in spring storms. The old corn planter had skipped rows last season, and the soybeans that came up after it were weak, yellow, and thin. The bank had started sending letters in white envelopes Clara left unopened on the kitchen table until night, when the house was quiet enough for bad news. And now, instead of buying seed treatment, instead of saving for diesel, instead of paying down the loan, Clara Whitcomb had spent real money on 200 sick chickens. By noon, the story had crossed the whole town. The girl from Whitcomb Farm had lost her mind. Clara drove home slowly, because the truck could not take the washboard road fast anymore. Behind her, the crates shifted and scratched. The chickens peered through the slats at the passing fields, at the ditches full of dry weeds, at the long rows of corn and soybeans stretching under a white June sky. Most of those fields belonged to men who had more equipment, more acreage, more money, and more confidence than she did. They had straight fences, and steel grain bins, and tractors with enclosed cabs. Clara had a 1978 pickup, a coughing tractor, a barn full of broken tools, and a farm that had been in her family too long for her to imagine losing it. Whitcomb Farm sat 3 miles outside town, past the Methodist church, past the diner with the cracked neon sign, past the county road where the pavement gave up and turned into dust. Her grandfather had bought the first 40 acres after coming home from the war. Her father had added 20 more before the prices climbed beyond reach. For years, the farm had raised corn, soybeans, a few beef calves, and enough vegetables to fill the roadside stand every summer. It had never made anyone rich, but it had kept the lights on, the pantry full, and the Whitcomb name tied to the soil. Then came 3 bad years in a row. First, a wet spring drowned the low field. Then a dry summer burned the pasture down to wire. Then her father had a stroke in the shop beside the tractor, one hand still resting on a wrench when Clara found him. He lived, but he came home quieter, weaker, and unable to work more than a few minutes without needing to sit. The farm did not wait for him to heal. Weeds kept growing. Machinery kept breaking. The bank kept counting. Clara had finished high school on a Friday and taken over the farm the next Monday. People said she should sell before she lost everything. They said she was too young to know what land could take from a person. They said a girl with notebooks and old family stories could not compete with men who had farmed twice as long as she had been alive. Clara heard all of it. She heard it at the diner when voices lowered as she passed. She heard it at the parts counter when conversations stopped too quickly. She heard it from the road, where pickups slowed near her fields just long enough for drivers to look at the crooked fences and shake their heads. She never answered. That afternoon, she parked beside the old chicken house behind the barn. The building had not held birds since her grandfather's time. One window was gone. The door sagged from one hinge. Raccoon tracks crossed the dust inside. Clara set the crates in the shade, carried out rotted boards, nailed wire over gaps, and dragged fresh straw across the floor until the place smelled less like abandonment and more like a beginning. The chickens stumbled out one by one. Some collapsed in the straw, some scratched weakly. Some stood still, as if they had forgotten what open space felt like. Clara moved among them slowly, setting shallow pans of water where they could reach them. She mixed cheap feed with cracked corn, crushed garlic, apple cider vinegar, and dried herbs from jars her mother had once kept above the stove. She did not know whether every remedy would work, but she knew sick animals needed clean bedding, clean water, shade, and time. By evening, 3 chickens had died. She buried them beyond the garden. The next morning, 2 more were gone. The town did not see those burials. It only saw Clara hauling feed sacks she could barely afford and patching a chicken house that everyone had forgotten. It saw her pushing wheelbarrows before sunrise and pulling a small homemade chicken shelter across the field with a chain hooked to the lawn tractor. It saw a foolish girl wasting her final season on birds that might never lay a single egg. By the end of the week, the jokes had settled into the town like dust. At the diner, men nodded toward her empty booth after she left. At the feed store, people watched to see whether she would buy more medicine she could not afford. At the bank, her file sat near the edge of a desk beneath a red note marked for review. Clara kept her head down. She cleaned waterers. She burned spoiled bedding. She sorted the weakest birds into a smaller pen. She moved the healthier ones through strips of grass along the soybean field, letting them peck at beetles, larvae, and weed seeds. Every night, after checking on her father, she opened the old green ledger that had belonged to her family and wrote down what she had seen. Number of birds standing. Number feeding well. Droppings normal or loose. Insects near south fence. Bare patches recovering. Soybean leaves chewed near ditch. The ledger was not only her grandfather's. Her father had written in it too. His handwriting changed over the years. In the early pages, it was firm and square, pressed deep into the paper, with the confidence of a man who believed the farm would always answer if he worked hard enough. Later, after bad seasons and bad prices, the letters grew tighter. In the final entries before his stroke, some lines wavered, where his hand must have tired. Clara had found those pages difficult to read at first. Not because they were sad, but because they were honest. Her father had not written like a man with all the answers. He had crossed things out, questioned himself, marked failures in the margins, circled weather signs he did not fully understand yet. Beside one old note about grasshoppers gathering early along the south fence, he had written that his own father had trusted chickens before sprays were easy to buy. That single line stayed with Clara. Her father could no longer walk the fields with her the way he used to, but his thinking still moved through them. It was there when she knelt by the ditch and split dry soil with her pocket knife. It was there when she counted insects on the soybean leaves. It was there when she looked at 200 sick chickens and saw, not a flock, but a tool her family had forgotten how to use. 2 months earlier, when rain kept her out of the field, Clara had searched the attic for old tax papers and found a cardboard box tied with baling twine. Inside were yellowed county extension pamphlets and field journals from seasons long before she was born. The pages smelled like dust, motor oil, and dry paper. Most were ordinary farm notes, planting dates, rainfall, frost warnings, corn prices, repairs, calf weights. But one section stopped her. It described the summer of 1964, when a dry spring brought grasshoppers so thick they stripped fence rows and garden plants across half the county. Her grandfather had written that chemical sprays were hard to get and too expensive for small farms, but the free-range chickens had worked the field edges day after day, knocking back the first waves before they reached the young beans. He had not called it a miracle. He had written it the way farmers write true things, plain, practical, and careful. Clara found more notes tucked between the pages. Her father had circled old weather patterns: warm winter, dry spring, thin roadside grass, early insect hatch, birds gathering on power lines, egg masses in hard soil near ditches. That year looked painfully familiar. Clara had seen the signs herself. The ditch weeds were chewed earlier than normal. Wild turkeys had been scratching along the south field. When she knelt in the dry soil near the fence posts, she found small clusters in the dirt that looked like nothing to most people, and warning bells to anyone who knew what was coming. A county pest bulletin from years ago said the same thing her grandfather had seen with his own eyes. After the right kind of winter and the wrong kind of spring, grasshoppers did not arrive one at a time. They came like weather. Clara never believed 200 chickens could guard 60 acres by themselves. That was not the plan. Her grandfather's notes had made one thing clear: grasshoppers did not usually destroy a field from the middle first. They built pressure along the edges, in dry ditches, weedy fence lines, bare banks, and neglected corners, where eggs hatched in hard soil. If those first waves could be broken before they rolled inward, a crop had a chance. So Clara did not spread the birds everywhere. She used them like a moving fire break. Every morning, she pulled the mobile pens along the south ditch, the west fence, the low grass by the creek bed, and the first 15 rows of soybeans where the chewing always started. She fenced narrow strips with old snow fence and cattle panels, forcing the flock to work the danger zones instead of wandering into open field. The birds were not meant to erase the outbreak. They were meant to slow it, thin it, and keep the worst damage from crossing into the heart of the crop before rain or harvest could do the rest. From the road, it still looked like a girl dragging chicken coops across a dying farm. But in Clara's notebook, every move had a reason: edge pressure, hatch zone, leaf loss, bird rotation, recovery strip, next pass. The problem was keeping the birds alive long enough. July came in hot and hard. The air above the fields shimmered by 10 in the morning. The pasture faded from green to gray. The creek shrank into shallow pools under the cottonwoods. Clara worked in long sleeves despite the heat, because the chicken wire tore her arms and the sun burned the back of her neck raw. She built mobile pens from scrap lumber, old bicycle wheels, and bent roofing tin. She moved them every day, sometimes twice, so the birds had fresh ground and the soil would not sour under them. More chickens died, but fewer each week. The survivors changed slowly. Their combs brightened, their eyes sharpened, new feathers pushed through bare skin. They began to run when Clara opened the pen, not away from her, but toward the field edges where beetles jumped and moths lifted out of the weeds. They scratched through dry leaves beneath the soybeans. They broke apart manure clumps from the cattle yard. They worked the soil with restless feet and left behind small dark scatterings of fertilizer that disappeared after the next light rain. Clara recorded everything. She marked the strips where the birds had passed. She counted chewed leaves in the soybeans. She watched the difference between the rows near the chicken runs and the rows farther out. The change was not dramatic enough for a person driving by at 40 miles an hour. But from her knees, with dirt under her fingernails and a pencil behind her ear, Clara could see it. The plants near the rotated birds held a deeper green. The insect damage stayed lower. The soil under the straw mulch held moisture longer. Still, progress did not pay the bank. One night, after her father had gone to bed, Clara sat at the kitchen table beneath the yellow light and spread the month's papers in front of her. The bank notice was on top. Beneath it sat the feed bill, the fuel account, the property tax reminder, and a handwritten estimate for a tractor part she still had not installed. None of them surprised her anymore. That was what frightened her most. Bad news had become so ordinary that she could sort it by due date. Through the open window came the dry clicking of insects in the weeds and the slow creak of the windmill that no longer pumped enough water to matter. Clara looked past the papers toward the dark outline of the barn and imagined, for one sharp second, what the place would look like without her name on the mailbox. Someone else would tear down the old chicken house. Someone else would rip out her mother's garden. Someone else would plow the lane where her father had taught her to drive by letting her steer the truck from his lap. Her hands tightened around the edge of the table. Then she folded the bank letter, slid it beneath her grandfather's ledger, and set her alarm for 4:30. By sunrise, she was outside again. The first grasshoppers appeared along the south fence 2 days later. They were small at first, easy to miss unless a person knew how to look. Clara saw them flick from the dry grass as she walked the ditch. A dozen became 100. 100 became a moving shimmer along the weeds. By the end of the week, the county road seemed alive in places, the grass snapping and jumping with each passing truck. Then the heat settled in and did not leave. For 19 days, no real rain fell. The sky turned pale and empty. Dust followed every vehicle down the road. Pastures browned, gardens curled, soybean leaves folded inward like hands trying to hold moisture. Across the county, grasshoppers moved out of the ditches and into the fields. The first farm to lose its garden belonged to a man who had laughed at Clara at the feed store. The second lost the edge of a hayfield. Then came the soybeans west of town. Leaves vanished from the outside rows so fast that people drove out to look, not because they could help, but because disaster has a way of drawing witnesses. Spray prices jumped. The feed store ran short. The county agent's phone rang until his voicemail filled. Farmers who had spent years mocking old methods waited in line for chemicals that might arrive too late. Clara watched the outbreak reach her neighbor's field on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, the grasshoppers were at Whitcomb Farm. They came in waves from the south ditch, rising and landing, clicking against tin, bouncing off fence posts, clinging to soybean leaves in hungry clusters. Clara stood at the edge of the field with the sun barely up, her boots planted in dust, her throat tight. If she had guessed wrong, there would be nothing left to save. If the birds scattered wrong, if they were too weak, if the pens were too small, if the pressure was too heavy, the crop would vanish, and the bank would take the farm before winter. On the morning the grasshoppers reached Whitcomb Farm, her father stood on the porch with one hand resting on his cane. He did not call out advice. He did not tell her what to do. His voice had grown too tired for that, and maybe he knew this had to be her decision. But when Clara turned back once before opening the first pen, he lifted 2 fingers from the cane. It was barely a gesture. Still, it was enough. Clara opened the first mobile pen. The chickens rushed out. They were not pretty birds. Some still had ragged feathers. Some carried scars from whatever place they had come from. But they were alive, alert, and hungry. They spread along the field edge in a loose, frantic line, pecking, chasing, scratching, swallowing one insect after another. Clara opened the next pen, then the next. Birds flooded the ditch bank and the grassy strips between the crop rows. They worked with a speed that made the land itself seem to wake up. All day, Clara moved water and shade. She shifted panels to guide the birds. She used old snow fence to hold them along the worst edges. She rotated them before the heat could break them down. Her father watched from the porch, his lifted fingers still burning in her mind like a small flame. The grasshoppers did not disappear. Nothing so simple happened. They still chewed. They still moved. They still came in from the ditch and lifted in clouds when Clara walked the rows. But where the chickens worked, the pressure broke. The plants along those guarded strips kept more leaves. The worst damage slowed before it crossed deeper into the field. By the third day, the difference was visible from the road. Neighboring fields showed pale scars along their edges, some stripped nearly bare. Clara's fields looked rough, uneven, and stressed, but they were still green. The mobile pens sat like patched-up wooden ships in a sea of soybeans, and around them moved 200 once unwanted birds that no one was laughing at anymore. Trucks began slowing again at Whitcomb Farm. This time, nobody leaned out to joke. The county agent came first, parking near the lane and walking the field with a clipboard in his hand. The feed store owner came the next evening, under the excuse of delivering a back-ordered sack of mineral mix. Two neighboring farmers stopped at the fence and stood there in silence, looking from Clara to the chickens to the soybeans that should have been gone. Clara did not explain more than necessary. She showed the ledger, she showed the dates. She showed the strips the chickens had worked before the outbreak and the strips they had reached after. She showed the old notes from her grandfather and the weather pattern her father had circled months before the county started worrying. She did not make it sound like magic. It was not magic. It was timing, observation, hard work, and a willingness to use what everyone else had thrown away. The outbreak passed slowly. Rain finally came in August. Not enough to save every field, but enough to let damaged plants decide whether they still had life in them. Clara's soybeans flowered late and set pods unevenly, but they held. The corn patch near the barn, protected by the same rotating birds, recovered better than anyone expected. The vegetable stand opened with fewer baskets than in the old days, but people came anyway, partly for tomatoes and cucumbers, partly to see the farm everyone had expected to fail. At harvest, Whitcomb Farm did not break a county record. It did something more important. It survived. The yield was strong enough to cover the operating note. The roadside vegetables paid the feed bill. The chickens, now healthy and laying, brought steady egg money from families who suddenly liked the idea of buying from a farm that had beaten the grasshoppers without drowning the fields in chemicals. Clara sold a small group of pullets to a neighbor who had once shaken his head at her in town. She kept the rest and built better mobile coops from salvaged wagon frames. When she walked into the bank that fall, she wore the same faded cap and the same scuffed boots. The banker opened her file with the careful expression of a man prepared for bad news. Clara placed the payment slip on his desk, then the next one, then the plan for the winter egg accounts and spring rotations. By the time she left, the red note was gone from her file. Outside, the maple trees along Main Street had started turning gold. At Miller's Feed and Supply, nobody laughed when Clara backed her truck to the loading dock. The same gravel crunched under her tires. The same bell rang over the door. The same counter held the same dust and receipt books and feed catalogs. But the room changed when she stepped inside. People looked at her differently now, not with pity, not with amusement, but with the uncomfortable respect given to someone who had been right before anyone else understood the question. The owner loaded her feed himself. That winter, Clara repaired the chicken house properly. She replaced the broken window, fixed the roof, and painted the door a deep red, like it had been in an old photograph of her grandfather standing beside it. Her father grew strong enough to walk the lane most mornings, and sometimes Clara found him sitting near the fence, watching the birds scatter through winter cover crops, a faint smile hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. In the evenings, she kept writing in the ledger. She did not write about proving anyone wrong. She did not write about laughter or pride or the long weeks when the town had waited for her to fail. She wrote what mattered: dates, weather, soil moisture, bird health, insect pressure, crop response, costs, mistakes, improvements, things her children might need someday, or a neighbor's child, or some other young farmer standing in a feed store with more courage than money. On the last page of that season's notes, beneath her grandfather's old record of the 1964 grasshoppers, Clara added one sentence of her own. Some farms are saved by tractors, some by rain, and some by creatures nobody wanted. Years later, people in the county still talked about the summer the grasshoppers came. They talked about the fields stripped to stems, the feed store shelves sitting empty, the dust hanging over the roads, and the strange sight of Clara Whitcomb's ragged flock moving through the beans like a living shield. But Clara carried a quieter version of that summer. It lived in the feel of the last envelope of cash leaving her hand, in the dry weight of the first dead birds she buried beyond the garden, in the long nights when the bank letters sat under the yellow kitchen light and her father's old ledger lay open beside them. In the morning she unlatched the first mobile pen and watched a plan nobody believed in step into the field on thin legs, hungry and alive. That was the day Whitcomb Farm stopped being a place waiting to be lost. it became a legacy again.